So, thank you once again. My name's Amanda Davison-Young. I'm the CEO of The Tablet, and I'm absolutely delighted tonight to introduce my colleague, Ruth Gledhill, who's the digital and home news editor for The Tablet. She'll be hosting this webinar, which is entitled Assisted Dying, A Question of Faith, Ethics and Public Policy. Good evening to you, Ruth. Good to see you.
Evening, Amanda. Thank you. So, as you all know, MPs will again later this week debate the proposed changes to this controversial bill. And if assisted dying does become legal in England and Wales, this would be a really big change. Current laws prevent medics from helping patients carry out a wish to die. On Tuesday, also, a separate bill has passed an initial vote in Scotland. Now, a BBC survey only today suggested GPs are divided pretty much down the middle over support or opposition to assisted dying. One said, "We are doctors, not murderers," yet another said, "This is a basic human right." Also, this week, the Royal College of Psychiatrists, an organisation that has spent much of its life trying to prevent suicide, listed 9 reasons it has concerns about the bill. So, with us tonight to help clarify the issues and to help us know how to express concerns we might have is first Dr. Lily Lamb. She's a GP in Northumberland, a clinical academic and undergraduate teacher at Newcastle University, a member of the Royal College of GPs Council. And in this role, she sat on the RCGP Short Life Working Group on Assisted Dying. Her research is in the area of GP workforce recruitment and retention, and she's interested in the potential consequences of legislation of assisted dying on the existing and future GP workforce. In particular, the potential for moral injury and resultant mental health problems. Our next speaker will be Julian Hughes. He was an NHS consultant for more than 20 years in North Tyneside and Newcastle. And he was honorary professor of philosophy of ageing at Newcastle Uni and subsequently professor in old age psychiatry at University of Belfast. He had a particular interest in palliative care for people living with dementia. Initially, he qualified in medicine from Bristol, then studied philosophy as an undergrad at Oxford and for his PhD at Warwick. He was elected a fellow of both the Royal College of Psychiatrists and the Royal College of Physicians of Edinburgh, and has advised various national and international bodies and was the deputy chair of the Nuffield Council on Bioethics. He remained an honorary professor at Bristol and continues to write, his most recent books being Dementia and Ethics Reconsidered and The Reality of Assisted Dying, Understanding the Issues. And our third speaker will be someone many of us are already familiar with, Philip Booth, Director of Catholic Mission and Professor of Finance, Public Policy and Ethics at St Mary's University, Twickenham. He's also Director of Policy and Research at the Catholic Bishops' Conference of England and Wales and a Fellow of the Institute of Actuaries and of the Royal Statistical Society. So thank you very much, all of you, for coming, and I'm really interested to hear what you say. First of all, Lily, over to you.
Thank you, Ruth, and thank you, Amanda, for the invitation to speak. And thank you to all of you who've come along this evening. It's wonderful to see you all, and particularly to see some friends in the audience. Thank you for joining. So as Ruth said, I'm Lily. I'm a GP in Northumberland, and I'm also a clinical academic, and I teach medical students at Newcastle University. And I've been a GP for 10 years now. I'm currently doing a PhD funded by the National Institute for Health Research, focusing on the recruitment of undergraduates to careers as GPs. And I have particular research interests in the retention and mental health of the GP workforce. I also sit on the Royal College of GPs Council, and I represent GPs in the North East England. I've been doing a lot of work raising concerns in this area, and particularly about the impact on the GP workforce if the legislation is passed. I sat on the Royal College of GPs working group looking at assisted dying, and I was actually in Parliament last night speaking to MPs alongside a panel of other concerned healthcare professionals about the issues that we see with the Leadbeater bill, and they wanted to discuss potential amendments with us. So that was a really great opportunity to raise concerns, and I focus specifically on the workforce who will be delivering assisted dying. In the next 5 to 10 minutes, I hope to give you an overview of my role in end-of-life care as a GP, and some key areas of concern I have if this bill passes. I wanted to start with a quote I came across from a study conducted a few years ago in the Netherlands. It was a study of GPs who were involved in providing assisted deaths. And the quote goes as follows: "When euthanasia was not performed, I found the deathbed a special aspect of the profession. It was an honour to be allowed to guide someone to his or her final moment. With euthanasia, I always feel, was that necessary? I hate it. The patient is no longer granted the time for a natural dying process. He's saddled with the question, when do I want euthanasia? To have to decide about the moment of death has created enormous unrest around the deathbed." We hear an awful lot about suffering and how this bill is the answer and the solution to the problems people have at the end of life. But perhaps it's less talked about not only the pressure on the workforce who are delivering that assisted death, but the things that can go wrong as well. So as I said, I've been a GP for 10 years, and in that time I've diagnosed terminal illness, I've provided palliative care, I've visited dying people in their homes, and I've managed their symptoms. I've assisted people at the time of their death, not by ending their lives, but by supporting their emotional, physical, spiritual, and social needs. I've seen suffering, but this is typically around the time that people realize their illness is terminal and that treatment is futile. So commonly it will occur around the time the oncologist says that there's metastatic cancer and there's no more treatment that can be offered. Often people are very, very upset around that time and they'll present with physical symptoms, anxiety, loss of hope, depression. But often, spending time with that person and providing a holistic approach, thinking about their emotional, physical, spiritual, social needs can really help. And often just a bit of time actually allows them to push through that suffering and start to kind of enjoy their last months or weeks. I was going to illustrate that with a story. So a couple of years ago, I got called to do a home visit to a lady who I'd never met before. She didn't really have much of a medical history, but she had been diagnosed with mesothelioma, which is a type of lung cancer. And unfortunately, her oncologist had said that the cancer had spread and that there was no hope for further treatment. So I got asked to do a home visit because she was feeling very breathless. And I went along not really knowing what to expect, but I found this very fit woman kind of in her lycra, who was breathless, but she was breathless because she'd just got off an exercise bike. And she basically was trying her absolute best to keep going with her cycling on her exercise bike that she'd done her whole life in order to maintain her function for as long as possible because she was very, very scared of death. She also had some pain. She was really, really desperate to fight, not ready to die at all, and very, very kind of didn't want to take any medications to manage the symptoms, very wary of medications. So I just sat with her, chatted to her, asked what she was scared of, how she felt about death. And she didn't really want me to do anything. She just wanted me to sit with her. So we sat and we watched Wimbledon. And then I left and went back to visit her a few more times over the coming weeks. She showed me cards she'd made for family members who to leave to them after she'd died. We watched more tennis and really I was just there for her as the Macmillan nurses and the community nurses were. And she moved out of that fear and that suffering, accepted that she could no longer go on her exercise bike in the way she always had done. But she moved through to a period of acceptance and then she died very peacefully, actually. So that case really, to me, illustrates the power of holistic care. And actually, a lot of the time as a doctor, we're not prescribing fancy medications. We're just there to comfort people at their time of need. But unfortunately, not every patient who needs it gets palliative care. There's something of a postcode lottery in the UK, and while some areas have great provision, many do not. In my area, we've got access to Tyndale Hospice at home. We've got St Oswald's Hospice, Marie Curie, but hospices are reliant on charitable funding, and typically less than a third of their funding is from the NHS. So they are dependent on things like car boot sales to pay their staff, which makes it very hard for them to run effectively. And often they have to close beds, even though they've got the beds physically there, they haven't got the staff to manage them. And I've certainly experienced times where a patient would have benefited from a hospice admission, typically because they're becoming unsafe at home. Perhaps they've got a brain tumor and they're falling a lot, or they're suffering from a lot of fluid building up as a result of a cancer. And sometimes there's just no bed available. And I'm aware in other regions, particularly areas of high deprivation, it can be even harder to get a hospice bed. And then there's the issue of GP resources. So a lot of palliative care is provided in general practice, but we know there aren't enough GPs. People struggle to get appointments. The home visits that we do to care for most people as they're reaching their final days are squeezed in between two clinics over lunchtime. So it's challenging to really meet the needs of everyone. Just a bit more about the GP workforce. So we know that 2 in 5 GPs are planning to leave the profession in the next 5 years, and 30% of GPs or more than 30% of GPs are suffering from burnout, and that's the highest of any medical profession. We also know that more than a third of people die in hospital when many of them probably don't want to. And that might be because they can't access a GP. 1 in 5 have no contact with their GP in the last 3 months, and 1 in 2 patients have no contact with specialist palliative care. So that's the situation that we're at the moment. I think it's worth also mentioning that the public don't always know what assisted dying means. Actually, the definition is the practice where a person is helped to take their own life by means of lethal drugs provided for a doctor for that purpose. But that's not understood by everyone. We hear a lot about the opinion polls saying that the public want the law to change, but actually 4 in 10 think that assisted dying means withdrawing life support. So, stopping a ventilator for someone who's on intensive care. 3 in 10 think it means refusal of life-prolonging treatment. So someone who is struggling with side effects of chemotherapy and decides they want to stop, even though that may shorten their life. Both of those are, currently accepted and normal medical practice. So that's an important point, as the public don't really know what they're pushing for all the time. So my main concerns really around the bill are, I think there is a risk of harm to the doctor-patient relationship. Trust is absolutely central to what we do. Establishing trust takes time, takes effort on our part and on the patients as well. There's a risk that legalising assisted dying will undermine trust. One of the panelists who spoke at the Parliament event last night is a palliative care consultant in Bradford, and she has been doing some work with minority ethnic groups asking for their views on assisted dying. And they feel, the people that she spoke about are very cautious in their trust of doctors already. But they said that if they knew that doctors were delivering this service, they just wouldn't go and see a doctor. They wouldn't want to go to hospital anymore because they'd be so scared that the doctor was going to kill them, which I thought was interesting and worrying, and not necessarily a narrative that's been heard. I think there are concerns around the safeguards of the bill and whether they would protect that trust. And, if palliative care and general practice support was reliable and available, could all suffering potentially be managed? Again, one of the things we debated last night was the bill about suffering, or was it about control? And actually, suffering isn't mentioned in the bill. We know in Oregon that the vast majority of people who request an assisted death do so for loss of autonomy, less able to engage in life activities, loss of dignity, loss of control of bodily functions, burden on family. And then number 6 is inadequate pain control, so right down the bottom. So typically it's not about suffering, as in pain causing suffering. The bill requires the request to be made voluntarily and without coercion, but coercion can be very difficult to detect. And again, often we have to get to know patients really, really well before they will trust us to open up about what's going on at home. And, you know, particularly if these assessments are being carried out over video conferencing, the chances of being able to detect that someone is being coerced subtly or they're a victim of domestic abuse strike me as being quite slim. I think depression is a major concern. It's quite common in people with terminal illness. It makes people feel they're a burden. And there is that risk that a vulnerable patient may feel they're a burden and then may ask for an assisted death for that reason. Health inequalities is another important one. I mentioned before that particularly in the Northeast, some of the most deprived areas have the worst access to palliative care. And if you can't access treatment, or you know, if you're developing cancers at a younger age, which we see in the Northeast, mortality and you know, life expectancy is much lower in the Northeast, mortality is much higher. So actually, is there a risk that the more deprived populations will be more likely to seek an assisted death if they're losing their benefits, if they can't afford to heat their home? Is that going to be seen as the only way out? And you know, there's evidence of that happening in Canada. The other issue around inequality is, you know, if this is an NHS service, it should really be accessible to all. But you know, chances are there will be few clinicians who are willing to participate in the process. And again, in Oregon, it's about 1%. So will there be equality of access to a service that's, you know, meant to be available to all? And then finally, just this idea around protection for doctors who wish to opt out. We're hearing that there's going to be an amendment to allow any doctor or healthcare professional to opt out of being involved in providing assisted dying for any reason. There isn't the same option for hospices, unfortunately. But what of the doctors who don't opt out, or what of the medical students who are coming through who see this as being part of the role of a doctor? You know, once it becomes normal practice, chances are it will just become an expectation that doctors deliver this. But evidence from around the world suggests that 15 to 20% of doctors who participate in the process develop significant ongoing, you know, emotional health problems. Moral injury is a risk, and moral injury can lead to mental health issues and attrition from careers. So it can potentially impact on the workforce. And then the other thing that's been seen in the Netherlands is doctors being coerced into having involvement in the process by patients and their families. So things like patients deciding on a date and putting a lot of pressure on the family practitioner to participate and make it happen. So doctors are potentially talked into doing things against their will. And yeah, the other concerns around is there a risk that opting out will lead to difficulties in patient relationships, complaints, reductions in practice ratings? And then finally, is there an expectation that assisted death will be discussed as a treatment option when someone has a terminal illness? So at the moment, the Montgomery ruling would say that when we're offering people treatment options, we should offer them all available options and discuss the risks and benefits so that they can make a truly informed decision. Now, if assisted dying is being considered a treatment option and it's an option for someone who has a 6-month prognosis, are we expected to therefore offer it, even if we have a conscientious objection? Again, the MPs last night weren't aware of that. That wasn't something they'd considered. So it's hugely complex. But I just wanted to finish with a quote from a family physician in Canada who said in 2019, few Canadian doctors foresaw that going neutral would guarantee the arrival of euthanasia, or that promises of a shot in the arm for palliative care would be forgotten. Even fewer realised that they would have no option but to cooperate with providing death on demand. It has become all too easy to end patients' lives. And that's it from me. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Lily. Well, that was truly chilling and very sobering. You know, some of this I've read and suspected and thought it myself, you know, about the impact on doctors, especially of moral injury. But yet to hear it spelled out like that in such a litany of harm is really really, truly concerning. But without further ado, Julian, are you with us? I know Julian's had a little bit of trouble with his connection to Zoom, so I just want to check that he's here and we're able to move on to him now.
Well, I hope so. Can you hear me?
I can. So just far away, and we'll all bear with you if you have a few problems. So don't worry, because we would really love to hear what you have to say.
I've gone on to I think, a slightly better internet connection, but if it starts dropping out again, I might just disappear forever. But I apologize if that happens, and I hope not.
Well, I
Um,
want to guarantee you that we won't assist you in that departure.
well, thank you. Well, I'm very
Sorry, I
grateful
hope
to,
that wasn't a tasteless joke.
well, don't, I wouldn't worry, but um, I'm very grateful to have been asked to take part in this. Very grateful to Ruth and to all the staff at the tablet. Um, I'm going to, can you still hear me? Oh, good. Um, I'm going to use the three headings from the title of the webinar, Faith, Ethics and Public Policy, to structure what I'm saying. Now, normally I don't mention faith when I talk about assisted dying for two reasons. First, it just doesn't cut much ice in the public forum, and it can easily lead to your views being simply dismissed. Secondly, when talking from an ethical point of view, I don't feel the need to use religious principles because I think the case can be made in purely secular terms. Nevertheless, our religion does provide us with some very profound comments and insights into the issues under consideration. Let me give you just a couple of examples. Pope Francis, in Dignitas Infinita, which came out in 2024, wrote, "Life is a right, not death, which must be welcomed, not administered." I think this puts the argument in a stark and striking manner, and of course, the courts have agreed that death is not a right. But I want to focus a little more on the notion of compassion. It's sometimes said that both sides of the argument are compassionate, but compassion means suffering with. It means accompanying the person. It is what good healthcare has always been about, sticking with the person through thick and thin, not giving up, always providing some sort of hope. Let's see what our religion has said about compassion. Pope St. John Paul II in Evangelium Vitae wrote, "True compassion leads to sharing another person's pain. It does not kill the person whose suffering we cannot bear." Again, this is starkly but well put. From Samaritanus Bonus, which is a letter issued by the Congregation of the Doctrine of the Faith in 2020, it says the following: "In reality, human compassion consists not in causing death, but in embracing the sick, in supporting them in their difficulties, in offering them affection, attention, and the means to alleviate the suffering." Suffering, of course, is something which those in favour of assisted dying will often emphasise. Well, listen to this also from Samaritanus Bonus. "Therefore, the end of life, inevitably presaged by pain and suffering, can be faced with dignity only by the re-signification of the event of death itself, by opening it to the horizon of eternal life and affirming the transcendent destiny of each person." This seems to me inspiring and a source of both strength and hope. But let me now talk about ethics. Out of the many topics that could be considered, I just want to pick out two. I want to spend some time thinking about the fundamental ethical principle at stake here, and then more briefly, I'll say something about dignity. The principled objection is against intentional killing. This is not merely a Christian concern. In the 4th or 5th centuries BC, when the Hippocratic Oath was concocted, it was clear to Hippocrates and his followers that the physician should do no harm or injustice to the patients. The oath continues, "Neither will I administer a poison to anybody who asks me to do so, nor will I suggest such a course." Think then of Aristotle writing in the 3rd century BC. For him, the end of medical art is clearly health. When treating a patient, the doctor should be guided by the goal of health. Even when treating an incurably sick patient, the doctor should aim at an approximation to health. It will always be the case that assisted suicide is contrary to the medical art. Excuse me. The principled objection is also part of the moral fabric of our culture. This is seen, for instance, in talk of the sanctity of life, which is spoken of by religious people, but is also expressed in secular terms. We see it, for instance, in the law. In a case called R versus Adams from 1957, Justice, later Lord Devlin, stated, "It remains the fact, and it remains the law, that no doctor, nor any man, no more in the case of the dying than in the healthy, has the right deliberately to cut the thread of life." Later, in 1994, Lord Walton, a neurologist, whilst acknowledging that many people have unpleasant deaths, said that nevertheless, society's prohibition of intentional killing is the cornerstone of law and of social relationships. We also see the principled objection in the foundations of the National Health Service, which is, and I quote, "a comprehensive health service designed to secure improvement in the physical and mental health of the people of England and Wales, and the prevention, diagnosis, and treatment of illness." But if the Leadbeater Bill comes into force, the prevention, diagnosis, and treatment of illness would now include commissioned voluntary assisted dying. Then there is Article 2 of the European Convention on Human Rights, the ECHR, which states that no one shall be deprived of his life intentionally. Now, the ECHR memorandum issued by the government on the 2nd of May states that the government's view is that the bill does not interfere with Article 2. There's lots to be said about this, much of it beyond my expertise. Nevertheless, if you look at some of the cases to which the government has drawn attention in its memorandum, such as Mortier versus Belgium in 2022, it is possible, at least, to ask some questions. That case concerned a lady called GT, who had chronic depression since her teenage years. She was told there was no further treatment. To be told in such an emphatic way that there is nothing more to be done is, of course, a good way to induce a sense of hopelessness. But I, as a psychiatrist, note that GT had apparently never been admitted to an inpatient unit. Nevertheless, she had her life ended under Belgian law. We know that a top barrister, Tom Cross KC, believes that assisted dying is not compatible with the Human Rights Convention. Whatever the legal debates, it is a clear principle. No one shall be deprived of his or her life intentionally. Anyone following Kim Leadbeater's bill will know that the Mental Capacity Act 2005 is often referred to. It is suggested, including by the Chief Medical Officer, that there are no problems using the Mental Capacity Act in relation to assisted suicide. However, the principled objection, the objection to intentional killing, is evident even here. Of course, the framers of Kim Leadbeater's bill have noticed this point, and there is an amendment of the Suicide Act 1961 so that it states, "A reference to an act that is capable of encouraging or assisting suicide does not include providing assistance to a person to end their own life." Well, another way of reading this is to say, a reference to an act that is capable of encouraging the person to end their own life does not include providing assistance to a person to end their own life. Or we could say, a reference to an act that is capable of encouraging or assisting suicide does not include providing assistance to suicide. This is a prime example of what George Orwell would have called doublethink. The Shorter Oxford English Dictionary defines this as the mental capacity to accept as equally valid two entirely contradictory opinions or beliefs. That's probably enough about the principled ethical objection to assisted suicide. Let me move on to discuss much more briefly dignity. Of course, people will have noticed that those in favour of a change in the law have purloined the word dignity. Dignity in dying could refer to good quality and perfectly ethical palliative care. It's now as if those against assisted suicide are against dignity. But this is, as Orwell again might have said, a perversion of our thinking by language. Dignity in Dying was more correctly known as the Voluntary Euthanasia Society. That was a more complicated title, but clearer. The point we have to make, made very well by Dan Sulmasy in various writings, is that there are different types of dignity, different understandings of the word. Attributed dignity is the dignity which we give to people and which we can take away from them. If we look after people badly, they will lack this sort of dignity. We can leave them looking dirty and soiled, for instance, or we can leave them in pain, which is itself an affront to dignity in this attributed sense. What we wish to emphasize, however, is the much deeper notion of intrinsic dignity. This is the sort of dignity that we have just because we are human beings. This is the sort of dignity which underlies the need for good clinical care so that people are not left suffering or dirty or soiled or lacking in hope and so forth. It is an affront to human dignity, to the intrinsic dignity of every human being, to suggest that the only sure way to maintain dignity is by assisted suicide. Finally, let me say something about public policy, again by focusing on only two issues, those of lethal drugs and equality. The Leadbeater Bill allows that drugs will be approved by the Secretary of State for Health, but this is contrary to all established practice for drug approval, and it bypasses the established safety and regulatory frameworks. The current drug regimens used in other countries are unlicensed and unregulated. There's little pharmacological understanding of the efficacy and safety of these drugs used at high doses. According to the bill, there will be little adverse event reporting and coroner referral is not required, which sets a very dangerous precedent. These issues are being hardly discussed. We should think about the side effects of the drugs and how they work or don't work. For instance, in Oregon in 2024, patients took between 1 minute and 137 hours to die. Allowing the Secretary of State for Health to make decisions about the use of lethal drugs is just bad public policy. What about equality? Well, the demand for equality is the force that will drive the expansion of the eligibility criteria for assisted suicide. This has been well set out by Scott Kim in the book that I edited with Baroness Finlay. Scott argues that the desire for equality leads to an ever-expanding boundary, which ultimately leads to assisted dying without boundary, death on mere demand, he says. We have seen this in action in other countries. Assisted deaths should be for people who are terminally ill, but on the grounds of equality, they should also be available to people in any suffering. And on the grounds of equality, they should be available to people suffering physically and mentally, but not just old people, also young people, including children, and so on. Whereas Scott argues that equal respect for all human lives implies that no one has the right to end the life of another. In the government's impact assessment around equality, it notes, and I quote, "Women are more likely to be victims of domestic abuse. They're more than twice as likely. Coercive control, as one type of domestic abuse, is not equally distributed throughout society. I think it would be naive not to recognize that there will be cases of abuse which lead to people having assisted suicide. It is said that there will be training for those involved so that they can spot coercion. I simply do not have faith that this training would be sufficient. We would need therapeutic relationships with genuine engagement over time. There would have to be a variety of reports about people. There would have to be interviews with other people, people who can be unbiased witnesses. In order to pick up coercive control and abuse, there would have to be surveillance, including covert surveillance. So the bills in Jersey, on the Isle of Man, in Scotland, and in England and Wales will always be deficient as acts of public policy. We should also keep in mind the words of John Maher, a psychiatrist working in Canada who therefore has experienced firsthand how these things go. He says, "Once euthanasia and assisted suicide are accepted, the social and political culture itself has a coercive force that is insidious and invidious. It also allows medical arrogance and ignorance to masquerade as benevolence. This coercive zeitgeist represents a coarsening of our relationships, our institutions, and our culture. To conclude, assisted suicide is wrong as a matter of faith, as a matter of ethics, and as a matter of public policy. It would flout fundamental moral principles, would lead to a coarsening of society by the expansion of the eligibility criteria, would be unsafe, and ignores or downplays the safe, moral, and inspirational alternative to assisted dying, which is good quality, innovative specialist palliative care for all. Thanks very much.
Thank you, Julian. Another really shocking and horrifying, actually, presentation, and another really chilling list of iniquities to do with this bill. I would just like to say to everybody that we do have with us Sarah MacDonald, who's one of our senior journalists, and she'll be writing a report for the tablet, online and in print, about this. So this webinar and the views expressed here by the people who've kindly given their time will have a wider circulation beyond this webinar, because we believe it's such an important issue coming up, and we want to play our part in trying to do what we can to stem this terrible tide. Philip, thank you very much for coming, and over to you, please.
Okay, thank you, Ruth. I'll start by saying that, unlike Lily and Julian, I'm not an expert in this area. I'm going to present an overview, which I hope will be helpful. But if I were on Mastermind, I wouldn't be choosing assisted suicide, as I prefer to call it, as my specialist subject, so to speak. Just let me say a little word about that. I prefer to use the word assisted suicide because that's what it is. Assisted dying is what people like Lily do when they help people who are coming towards the end of their life. It's what people in hospices do when they help people come towards the end of their life. But what we're talking about here is a legal framework to allow doctors to deliberately help others kill themselves. And I know that the proponents don't like using that phrase, and it's in a sense a great victory for the proponents that in nearly all of the media the phrase assisted dying is now used rather than assisted suicide. Now, it's not exactly clear. Perhaps I could just start by saying it's not exactly clear when the crucial vote will be on this bill. The most likely date is Friday, the 13th of June, with a debate on amendments this coming Friday, the so-called report stage. And I would like to encourage you to contact your members of Parliament as soon as you can. If you've contacted them already, I would encourage you to contact them again, in fact, and as soon as you can, to avoid any hostages to fortune. If you go to the Bishops' Conference website, you can just press a link to go to the Right to Life email campaign, and there you can put your postcode in, and it will produce a ready drafted letter to your Member of Parliament, different depending on whether they voted for or against at the second reading. And you can edit that letter if you wish, and at the click of another button or two, it will then find its way to your Member of Parliament. And let me say quite strongly that the Catholic bishops, of course, oppose this bill in principle. In terms of communications with politicians, it's likely to be the case that any MP who is going to support or oppose the bill as a matter of principle is not going to change their mind at this stage. So I think it's helpful when you're communicating with members of Parliament, or indeed talking to other people, parishioners and so on, who might then be encouraged to communicate with their MPs, to use more practical arguments too, the sort of arguments we've heard from Lily and Julian earlier. We need about 30 members of Parliament who supported the bill to change their mind and vote against it this time, without people moving in the other direction. If you have practical experience, for example, as a health or social care worker, it's really important to incorporate that in any communication you have with a member of Parliament. It's exactly that type of experience which might sway MPs, or at the very least make them think that the whole issue needs more thought, and maybe cause them to abstain instead of vote for. Now, just a little bit, because Julian has covered this really, on what is the Catholic view of care at the end of life. Well, as Julian said, Catholics believe in compassion, a word which the proponents of assisted suicide have tried to adopt. Compassion means to suffer with others. It means accompanying people, especially during sickness, disability, old age, when people are frail and vulnerable, and so on. And assisted suicide is not compassion. The best form of care that we can give people who are in extreme discomfort is palliative care and pain relief, but together, of course, and we mustn't forget this, good human, spiritual, and pastoral support. The Church has called for more adequate funding for palliative care, an issue Lily has raised, and of course praised the wonderful work of the hospice movement, much of which is Christian in its inspiration. The evidence suggests, David Jones has done some work on this, that the provision of assisted suicide in jurisdictions undermines the provision of palliative care over time for a variety of reasons. Now, Lily raised the issue of conscientious objection, and this is something which was really whitewashed in the government's equalities impact assessment, especially in relation to religious belief. So, according to the bill as amended at the time the equalities impact assessment was produced, the bill said at that time that doctors who didn't wish to participate in assisted suicide would have to cooperate by directing the patient to information. Now, that's unacceptable for Christian doctors to cooperate in the act of helping somebody to commit suicide by directing them to information. No, if this wasn't a case of assisted suicide, but somebody who wanted to commit suicide in a different context, a Catholic in good conscience couldn't help them, direct them towards information to help them know how to do this. So the idea that, as suggested in the equalities impact assessment, that there's actually no problem in terms of religious people in healthcare and medical professions because they won't actually have to undertake the act or be one of the doctors who are very closely involved with the act. They'll only have to lead the patient towards information. I think reveals a basic ignorance about how people of faith understand these matters of conscience. So it may well be the case that the Act, as it stands at the moment, will have a serious effect on the whole medical profession, leading some doctors to have to choose between breaking the law, remaining in the profession, or violating their conscience. Care workers who oppose assisted suicide will find it virtually impossible not to become involved, for example, organising doctors' appointments and so on. Now, as Lily said, it's possible that amendments to the bill may deal with some of these issues, but the fact that that Parliament is dealing with legislation with profound moral consequences and which has dozens of pages of amendments, 39 pages of amendments published on Sunday night on these crucial issues, with only a few hours of debate, probably on Friday, maybe a few more in June, is in itself seriously problematic. And as the Cardinal Archbishop of Westminster, Vincent Nichols, has said, the whole process is a shambles. The bill is also potentially dangerous for Catholic hospices and care homes. There are several routes by which hospices and care homes might be required to cooperate with and facilitate assisted suicide. And in almost every jurisdiction in the world, except a couple of states in the United States, when assisted suicide has been brought in, hospices and care homes have been required to facilitate it and cooperate with it in some way. For example, under Clause 32 of the bill, the Secretary of State can develop regulations to ensure the availability of assisted suicide. And under that clause, he might require hospices and care homes to be involved, especially if they receive NHS or local authority funding, either directly or indirectly. Secondly, as Julian mentioned, equalities legislation could lead to all sorts of unforeseen consequences here. Well, actually, they could be relatively well foreseen, in fact, because these things have happened in other jurisdictions. A disabled person in a care home, for example, a Catholic care home, let's say, who cannot easily move or doesn't wish to move, could initiate a court case on the basis of disability discrimination, requiring the care home to facilitate assisted suicide for them. and this would then create a binding precedent. And in nearly every jurisdiction in the world, this or some other similar process has led to Catholic hospices and care homes having to be involved with assisted suicide. In addition, if the bill is passed, there may be nothing that a hospice or care home can do to stop an employee helping a client obtain assisted suicide and assisting them in that way. It's not impossible that hospices might have to end inpatient services if they are required to facilitate or assist with assisted suicide. St Gemma's Hospice in Leeds has suggested that this could be a result of the bill in their own evidence to the Bill Committee. And the Chief Executive of Hospice UK, which is not against assisted suicide in principle, has written, the implications for hospices must not be underestimated or sidelined. There are huge unanswered questions. Finally, let me just mention the issue of vulnerability, which both Julian and Lily mentioned. Anybody who comes into contact with the elderly, sick and disabled knows that they are vulnerable and can be easily pressurized to do things which are against their better nature. The legalization of assisted suicide would create huge pressure on society's most vulnerable people. In Oregon, which originally was a model for this bill's proposers, although they now argue that the bill is better than, as they would put it, the Oregon legislation, nearly 50% of those who underwent an assisted suicide between 1998 and 2021 cited fear of being a burden on their family, friends, or caregivers as a concern motivating their request. Many, many, many more than cited fear of pain or actual pain. We're also worried, and again, Julian has mentioned this issue about coercive control, where vulnerable people, nearly always women, are subjugated to the will of another person, nearly always a man, in a way that's imperceptible. Such people are especially vulnerable to assisted suicide, which would, in effect, amount to an undetectable murder. Nikki Dillon-Keene produced an excellent article on this issue, which is on the Tablet website. And the fact that the proponents of the bill have suggested that the bill as amended addresses the issue of coercive control, I'm afraid shows that they don't understand the problem, because by definition almost, it's imperceptible. And maybe I can just read one sentence from Nikki's article. She's talking about a conversation with a disabled woman. One disabled woman who has suffered from coercive control said in relation to the assisted suicide bill, "It is when your spouse wants to kill you and the state gives them a totally legal way to do it. My husband used to threaten to euthanize me if he got fed up with being my carer." So perhaps I can just conclude by saying that the bill is wrong in principle and flawed in practice. In response to some of the flaws, the proponents have developed complex mechanisms to deal with them, which leave the bill both incomprehensible and flawed. And I think the confusion around this bill is demonstrated by the views of the government's third most senior member, Rachel Reeves, MP, who is supporting the bill. She stated, "I can understand why people would want it, assisted suicide, and certainly my mum's parents suffered from Alzheimer's and dementia. The last few years of their life, my mum would say, were not worth living. They were deeply distressed and had no quality of life." Now, putting aside the phrases "not worth living" and "no quality of life," which if they're accepted in our culture could have deeply disturbing consequences, even under this bill, facilitating assisted suicide for somebody with dementia would be murder or manslaughter. So if the Chancellor of the Exchequer doesn't understand the implications of this bill which she is supporting, surely we shouldn't just make this change in our law after just a few hours debate. Thank you.
Thank you, Philip. That was a really helpful overview of some of the legislative and other general principles at stake after the expertise from our two medics here tonight. I'd just like to, we've got to go a couple of questions. I'd just like to put one myself, actually. I'm sure you all read the impact assessment that was published quite recently, and I found it quite chilling, you know, the huge cost savings that would be made. if this bill becomes law. And of course, the Catholic bishops are quite rightly, in my view, promoting increased provision of palliative care. But that, of course, would go the other way. That would cost a lot of money, not save a lot of money. So I wonder, to what extent do we think that it's really economics driving this? Do you want to go first, Philip, or?
Yes, okay. I mean, as it happens, I don't think it is really. I think no, an impact assessment has to be produced when there's a bill like this, and those impact assessments nearly always require that sort of the financial numbers are produced. And I mean, obviously, I wouldn't say this in a public forum, but I don't think that actually motivates as such the people who are promoting it. I think the concerns are, further down the track when this becomes institutionalized, it begins to change culture, and then as a result of that, people are taking decisions about should they fund palliative care, should they make assisted suicide more widely available, and in a sense, I found the equalities impact assessment more chilling, because so much of it was looking into whether or not there would be equal access to assisted suicide. And as Julian said, as soon as you start to think about those issues, the slippery slope, which we all talk about, and which some people say is scaremongering, actually becomes an inevitability, in fact. And then once it becomes embedded in culture, I think these decisions about money will begin to become important. But I don't think it's really driving Kim Ledbetter and the other supporters of the bill.
Thank you. So we have a question from Russell for Julian. In the US, lethal drugs are used to execute convicted murderers. And also says that he understands there's growing anxiety in the US that these often cause significant suffering. Is this a factor? Can we learn from this? And is this something that's come up in your researches and experience of this debate?
Well, the answer is yes. I mean, I then immediately have to say, pharmacology is not my top subject, and but there are a couple of papers that will be appearing very soon. I think they're already in a kind of preprint version, in which Baroness Sheila Hollins, who, as we'll know, is the president of the Catholic Union, has written with colleagues about this, and actually the cases of prisoners being put to death provides some of the best evidence that we need to look even more carefully at this. The worry is that people might be, as it were, anesthetized and immobilized, so they can't move and they can't sort of say anything, and yet they might be experiencing incredible pain from the drugs that are being given actually to kill them. People don't seem to grasp that this isn't a case of just your nice, friendly GP like Lily turning up with sort of one little tablet and giving you a tablet and then you fall asleep. It's a case of giving you, sometimes I'm told it's about 100 drugs, 100 tablets, and which you then have to crush up and swallow very quickly. And within that concoction, there can be 3 different things. So there's something to take away your anxiety, there's something to make you unable to move, and then there's something to actually kind of stop your heart from beating. Well, if the drugs aren't imbibed properly, or if some of them are vomited up, then you could end up with tremendous pain whilst not being able to tell anybody that you are in tremendous pain. So that these are our real worries, and it's why the whole question of the drugs needs to be looked at much more carefully, and we shouldn't just leave it to the Secretary of Health.
Thank you. Lily, a question for you, please. If so many people, including doctors and academics, are saying this is such a terrible idea, why do we think it is being pushed through like this? And how can this be a democratic decision? And what more can we do as the public to ensure this doesn't get approval? I was quite surprised, actually, and encouraged by Philip's figure that we only need 30 MPs to change their mind. But and I know, Lily, you were speaking to MPs. What do you think? Why is it? How has it got this momentum when there's so clearly, to me anyway, it's so clearly not a good idea.
That's a great question. Thank you, Ruth. So it's I've been reflecting on this a lot. I think part of it is a very clever campaign from Dignity in Dying, where they've appealed to people's emotions and compassion by sharing stories of suffering. So people have been able to see real people tell their stories, or people who have cancer and are scared for their future. And then I guess people believe that it's on the side of compassion and on the side of good to do something about that suffering. They're being told that the only solution is an assisted death. And as I said in my talk, a lot of people don't know what an assisted death is. They think it means, withdrawing treatment, or not having life-preserving treatment. Some people think it means palliative care. So I think the campaign's been very powerful. The campaign on the other side hasn't been anywhere near as, well funded. Particularly the organisation that represents doctors, Our Duty of Care, which has grown significantly in recent months, still, doesn't have much money at all, very limited resource to do much about this. But there has been a real movement amongst doctors, and indeed amongst GPs. So the Royal College of GPs moved to a position of, well, no position, neither for nor against assisted dying, about 2 months ago, following quite a controversial council vote on the issue. So we'd surveyed all of our members who are GPs, asking for their views on assisted dying. And actually what we found was that GPs were more opposed to assisted dying than they had been 5 years ago when we'd previously surveyed them. And support for assisted dying had actually dropped. So it was something like 48% against, 34 support, and only about 13% wanted to go neutral. But council voted to move to this neutral position because the narrative, again, that was spun was that's the only way we can represent all of our patients and all of our doctors. So then what we've seen is that's added fuel to the campaign around, these organisations have dropped their opposition, so therefore doctors are not opposed to assisted dying. So that's been quite powerful. It's unpleasant, but I get a sense that actually we're gaining some momentum and people are starting to listen. My MP has asked to meet with me tomorrow, having not engaged at all, and he voted for. So yeah, keep praying and hopefully we can turn the tide.
Well, that's really interesting, Lily. Thank you. So, one final question before I hand back to Amanda. Barbara asks, do the speakers feel that your strong and well-articulated views have been heard in the most appropriate places? So, Lily, again, just if you could just keep your responses brief to this one, please, because we're running out of time now. But yes, you sort of answered it just now, but is there anything else you can add to that?
Yes, absolutely. I think definitely with MPs yesterday, it's just whether it will be enough to make a difference.
Thank you. Julian.
I think we've been heard, but I don't, well, maybe I'm getting this around the wrong way, but I'm not sure that we've been listened to. Certainly, there's some of the MPs that I've spoken to, they sort of know the arguments, but they don't, for some of them, it just doesn't have an impact. There's a kind of implacability about some people who are in favor of it.
Yeah. Philip.
Well, I think at least to some extent. So the other side is funded probably at least 10 times the extent to which our side of the debate is funded. So I must pay tribute to a huge number of people who devoted their life to opposing assisted suicide. And yes, I think they have made a difference. When this Parliament was elected in July, I didn't think there was a chance of even coming close, actually, at the second reading vote. Yet it is still all to play for, so to speak.
Thank you very much. Well, we'll do our bit at making sure your views are heard in the right places. And thank you very much for sharing them with us.